was here probably a couple years ago.
Zichrono livracha.
Was it 3 or 4 years ago? He was here.
His memory will be a blessing.
Okay, so I want to go back to our source material and just as an introduction to this particular piece, which I don't know how many of you have actually heard of this piece, but this is about what today is commonly called a chevruta, a study partner. It's about two people, two of the sages who studied together regularly, Reish Lakish, whose actual name was Shimon ben Lakish, and Rabbi Yochanan. And you should know that chevruta is the term we usually use today for two people who regularly study together. But there is another similar term in rabbinic sources, and the term is bar plukta, which literally means the one with whom one disagrees. Okay? That's your normal study partner, the one who disagrees with you. Okay?
That's wonderful.
And this text is about the relationship between two people who studied together and who made a habit of disagreeing with one another. Okay? And so here is the text. Reish Lakish dies. Rabbi Yochanan is plunged into deep grief, and the rabbi said, "Who shall go to ease his mind? Let Rabbi Elazar ben Padat go, for he is sharp in his learning." They figure that, it'll somehow he'll manage to develop a relationship with Rabbi Yochanan that will ease his pain over losing his study partner. And so Elazar ben Padat went and sat before him. In response to every teaching that Rabbi Yochanan said, he said, there is a braita, an earlier rabbinic teaching, that supports you. And Rabbi Yochanan is not comforted by this. He says, are you like the son of Lakish? Are you like Reish Lakish? For each teaching that I said, the son of Lakish would raise 24 objections against me, to which I gave 24 answers, and from this, the learning expanded. And you say there's a braita that supports you. Do I not already know that what I said is right? So he went on, tearing his garments and weeping. Where are you, Bar Lakisha? Where are you, Bar Lakisha? And he cried thus until he lost his mind. The rabbis prayed for mercy upon him, and he died. Right? So,
and it was all his own fault. It's so sad.
I'm not sure I know what you mean by that, Ann.
He lost his sparring partner.
Well, yeah, that's the way to think of it. This is his sparring partner. Okay? But what does this tell us about the relationship between study partners?
They need to encourage each other by finding objections so that they can think harder.
That finding objections, disagreements, makes us work harder.
Okay, Rabbi, I have, I don't know if it's a question or a comment. I have a study partner, and she is a Torah Jew. So she is a lot more learned.
Well, that's good, because I'm a Torah Jew too.
Okay, so yeah. So I'm saying she's Orthodox, wears a shadel. I mean, she's very observant.
Oh, so she's not a Torah Jew.
I don't know how to respond to that.
That's okay. Just tell me what you want to tell me.
Her knowledge is so so much deeper than mine that it's the relationship is she is teaching me. And I'm listening to you thinking that maybe this is not the best choice because she is so much more learned than I am.
Well, I don't know. I mean, are you willing to challenge
I do.
some of what she says?
I do.
Okay, then you're fine.
No, the word is not challenge, but question.
What's the difference?
I think questioning shows my ignorance. Challenge, I think, would show that in whatever we're discussing, I'm on her level.
It still
I don't know that it
challenges
has
her.
to be that way. I think, people from different levels can challenge other people's assumptions.
Okay. All right.
So I think it's great that you're learning regularly with someone else. And as long as you are able to question, that's fine.
Okay, because we have a really good relationship and I'm learning so much.
Good.
Sounds great.
Okay. Yeah, Carolyn.
Carolyn, where's Carolyn?
Carolyn, we're not hearing you.
Unmute.
We're still not hearing you.
Carolyn, you are unmuted, or you were, but we couldn't hear you. Okay, we will do what you're
Okay,
waiting.
Carolyn's going in for repairs. Yeah. So, okay. Other comments or questions at this point?
In some ways, it's Elizabeth. In some ways, it reminds me of just kind of a yes man. That's, he was just
Yes,
like.
Elazar ben Padat is just being a yes man, and that's not the essence of learning.
No. You learn by.
And that's why I asked the question of Ronnie that I did, right? Because if you're able to challenge and to question what you're being told, then then you're fine.
Well, it's upper level thinking too.
Yes. Carolyn, are you aboard now? Try and unmute your new computer.
It's like old-fashioned blackboard.
Okay, if it is now.
There we go.
Yeah, I do. I was back to the earlier question. Sorry about the delay.
Now, please.
That questioning, even for clarification's sake, makes I feel can often have the other individual that may be considered more learned re-examine what they're saying and possibly be open to other interpretations as well.
Yeah. So that's where the value of dispute comes in. Okay. Someone else had a comment? Okay. So now we come to the question that, in certain disputes, are there views which are just not acceptable? They're just completely out of bounds. So for instance, is there anyone who we would not admit to the Jewish community?
If they believed in many gods.
Someone who's a polytheist, okay? And who is not born Jewish. Okay, we'll just, but they say, I'm attracted to certain things about Judaism, and so I want to be a Jew as well as, a polytheist. Would that be acceptable? Yeah, so there's a limit, right? Someone who came in who claimed to be a Jew for Jesus, right? Yeah, that would be out of bounds, right? So, there are limits to pluralism. So on this theme, we now have a short video from Dr. Benjamin Summer, and Jennifer is going to pull that up for us here. It's coming.
In many ways, machloket, debate and argument, are at the heart of Jewish history and Jewish theology. In all periods of Jewish history, from the Bible through the rabbinic period and the medieval period into the modern period, we're constantly seeing machlokot l'shem shamayim, debates for the sake of heaven between different biblical authors, between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael, between philosophers and mystics in the Middle Ages. This isn't just a characteristic of modern Judaism. It's really at the heart of all periods of Judaism. At the same time, though, I think it's important to realize that I think there's always been limits of the debate. This is not a debate in which, or these aren't a series of debates in which any opinion goes. In the biblical period, for example, we can find lots of different ideas about God in the Bible, but you'll never find biblical authors who believe that we can pray to more than one God, or biblical authors who think that atheism or agnosticism is an okay option. There's a debate about the nature of God in the Bible, some really very, very major debates about the nature of God in the Bible, but there's an agreement that there's one of them. There aren't two and there aren't zero. Similarly, in the Bible, there's constant debate about the law, about what the law actually is. Different writers in the Chumash itself argue over how you're supposed to do the Passover offering correctly, what should be the correct social and economic legislation. But all the different authors in the Torah agree that law is central, that the covenant between God and Israel gets expressed through Israel's observance of the law. So there's always debate, but there are also always limits to the debate. There are certain boundaries beyond which we're no longer dealing with a Jewish debate, and now we're starting to deal with a debate between Judaism and some other religious or philosophical system. And I think it's important that there are limits to the debate. There's a very significant difference, I think, between pluralism and relativism. Judaism is not a tradition that says anything goes, which I would regard as a relativistic point of view. It is a tradition that has always engaged in a certain amount of pluralism. There's a certain degree to which Jewish communities, different Jewish communities, can live together while agreeing to disagree about certain subjects. So pluralism, a certain amount of disagreement, works for Judaism, and I think actually strengthens Judaism. We have a certain number of resources in our tradition, opinions that were expressed, sometimes that were unpopular or were very, very marginal, that hundreds of years later turned out to be very, very important. The fact that in Maimonides you can find this extraordinary synthesis of Aristotelian rationalism and biblical and rabbinic covenantal religion, that seems kind of obvious to us now. Of course, in his own day, this was extraordinarily controversial. But over centuries, and in some ways especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, the openness, the intellectual openness of Maimonides to creating a synthesis of Judaism and Western culture turned out to be a spectacular tool and a spectacular example for modern Jews who were wondering whether it was even possible to do such a synthesis. So I think that this openness to multiple points of view and to listening respectfully to points of view that I'm pretty positive are wrong, that kind of openness in the long run creates a much, much stronger Jewish people.
Okay. Reactions, thoughts? Yeah, Daniel.
First thing that occurred to me is when he starts saying, there are limits, when he's talking about that we debate everything. So when we all kind of jumped up and said, well, polytheism is out, who are we to decide that? I mean, the limits are debatable themselves. Who decides? I happen to think polytheism is pretty anti-Jewish. It's not compatible.
Right.
But there's other ones, if you bring it in a little bit, that there would be a lot of disagreement about.
Yes. So I think that, you know, in one sense, the Jewish people at large, and in another sense, the rabbinic leadership have, over time, sort of delineated what the limits are. And most people within the Jewish camp accept that those limits are real. And, you know, some people will challenge the boundaries a little bit. That's fine. Yeah, Carolyn?
I was going to say that I think, you know, what an individual's concept of that one God is, certainly mine is quite conceivably quite different from someone that calls themselves a Torah Jew. But you know, I have my own personal concept of what I recognize as that personal relationship that is a God. It may not be what anyone else's in the rooms is, but I would call it a one concept.
Okay. Daniel, you asked.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. Equality of women on the bima was way out of bounds 200 years ago, and we went past it. And in the same way, so when the rabbi that was speaking, I think it was a rabbi, said, you know, there are going to be limits. I'm not so sure that there are. I mean, Judaism, and just let me finish, please. There are going to be limits that we've already passed that were so out of bounds 200 years ago that they would be the same thing today as saying polytheism.
Yes. So I think part of the reason for that is because society changes, Judaism and the boundaries of Judaism sometimes change with those changes. Okay? And that's what happened on the women's issue. That's what's happening on the issue of sexual preference. Okay? Because we are seeing different understandings about those matters, then, you know, Judaism is adapting to those circumstances as well. Doesn't mean that we don't have a certain amount of dispute about it, but, you know, that's part of the process of change as well. You know, it'd be really shocking if one day everybody woke up and said, well, sure, all these changes are logical. Right? Because it's inevitable that there will be resistance to change. Yes, Ann.
There's an amazing variety of the kinds of changes that we're seeing today. In the case of women, the Bible had women leaders, women prophets, women judges, and women leaders of cities, but they didn't have approval of, I don't know. It doesn't say anything about homosexuality being okay, but it's possible to question what those verses mean that say it's not okay. But it says you have to do Torah. It says you have. It says all through the prophets that you cannot worship more than one God, even though they did, but they kept on and on about that. So that goes all the way back to the Bible. But nowadays, there's people who officially have said you don't have to do Torah. There's a whole denomination that says it's okay, you don't have to do any of that, and you can eat shrimp, whatever. And we don't say they're not Jews. And we should.
No, but the difference is that we do retain our understanding of who is a Jew within the traditional community.
You mean somebody with a Jewish mother, or somebody who converts,
or someone who says, that it's okay to eat shrimp, that, that's irrelevant as far as their Jewish identity, whether they are what we would consider to be a full-fledged member of the Jewish community.
And if they go around eating shrimp and whale and who knows what,
yeah,
then
Lou, you
that
had a
doesn't
comment.
make them not.
Yeah, Lou?
Yeah, I think it's reasonable to have boundaries to define what Judaism is and who is a Jew. And although those boundaries can be argued, ultimately it comes down to us being able to define ourselves, not being defined by others outside of Judaism.
Yeah. Steve?
Kind of, or maybe I'm going to kind of repeat a little bit looser. I think there's a difference between boundaries and answers. So the boundaries of, like, how do we practice Judaism? The answers can change over time as communities change, but I think the boundaries of the discussion have not changed that much. So the boundary is what's proper Jewish practice. So, the answer can be different over time I think the boundary is still the same. I think there's certain things that are still out of bounds. Maybe boundaries can change a little bit, but not nearly as much as our answers to those questions can be within those boundaries.
Yeah. Karen?
I'm thinking of many people that don't believe in God and certainly claim that they're Jewish.
Yeah.
Wondering.
Which speaks to how hard you have to work to be kicked out of the Jewish community.
You can even be Orthodox and be an atheist.
But I'd assume they're still recognized as Jews, right? Even though they don't believe in God.
Yeah, right. Right. I mean, I think we would be hard pressed to actually convert someone to Judaism who said they didn't believe in God. Right. But if someone is born Jewish and says, I lost my faith when I was about 9, right? Or 19 or 29 or whatever, right? Makes no difference. It does not disqualify them from being part of the Jewish people, right? It just means that they happen not to believe in one of our core beliefs. That's all. Somebody else had a comment? Okay. So I want to take you to the next text, which actually gives you an answer from Rashi about what the boundary might be, how to define, or how we will define what's Jewish and what's not. And Rashi says, one does not find either party in the dispute bringing proof from the Torah of another God, but only from the Torah of our God. In other words, where do you get your argument from? Does your argument, no matter how loosely the argument might be based on our Torah, it has to come from our Torah. You define Torah in the broadest possible sense, but that's where the argument should come from. Right? Yes, Daniel.
So if I were to make an argument based on basically secular morality, but there really isn't a direct quote from the Torah or a direct reference to Torah law, is that out of bounds?
No, I mean, you have to have something from a Jewish tradition, whether it is scripture or Mishnah or Talmud or Midrash or whatever it might be, on which to, I mean, for the most part, secular morality can also be located within Jewish sources. So you shouldn't have a real problem finding something that is, purely a moral statement.
But I could look at the New Testament, or the Christian Bible rather, the Quran, and there are statements made there that are, very in line with Jewish thought. So
Yes, they're just not acceptable evidence within Jewish thought.
okay,
Right?
the light just went on for me, Rabbi.
Sometimes we will say that this is something we share with certain other religions, as if to say that, look, there are other like-minded people, who come to this from a different place. But it doesn't mean that we accept that as straightforward evidence. Aurora and Bob ask a question: how does one get kicked out of Judaism? We don't have a form of disfellowship like the Jehovah's Witnesses. That's correct. What we do have, although it is extremely rare, especially today, is a form of excommunication. The Hebrew term is called cherem. Okay? Cherem, you ever heard the phrase being put in cherem? Okay, so what it means is basically you are put outside the community. No one in the community is supposed to have anything to do with you. Until you repent and get back in line. Right? Now, the most famous case of this in Jewish history, I'm sure many of you know this, was applied to Baruch Spinoza. Right? Whether it was appropriate or not, that's a whole nother issue. But that's what the Dutch Jewish community did with him. They were, they felt that he was an embarrassment and that he was out of line significantly. All right, so Aurora and Bob, you mentioned Miriam. Miriam is put outside the camp temporarily, right? And everybody understands that that was temporary. She's michutz lamachaneh. She is set outside the encampment for 7 days, right? But that's it. And everybody understands that that is temporary, right? That's not a permanent form of cherem, or, permanent until you repent, right? Nothing is necessarily permanent. If Spinoza had disavowed all the things he had said and written before, and they probably would have let him back in. Okay. We rarely have cherem today because we're not in any way a unified Jewish community. So if one group puts someone in cherem, there's always another group that'll take them. Right?
Rabbi?
Yes, Karen.
I know many years back, when people took their own lives, they were buried somewhat outside of the cemetery, if I'm not mistaken. I know that's not quite the same thing you're talking about, but what was that supposed to
That was supposed to indicate discouragement of suicide, right? That's why it existed. It was never meant to say that these people weren't Jewish. If they were going to say they weren't Jewish, then they would have buried them outside the cemetery entirely.
Where did they bury him?
They buried them in the corner. The corner.
Weren't they? I thought they were sort of outside the gate. No.
No, not necessarily. I've been to Jewish cemeteries where there was a special section for people, and especially in ages past, before it was realized that, many people committed suicide from depression. We understand today depression is an illness, etc. Right? So that's a whole different matter. And Steve also here mentions in the chat Korach, right? It's not suggesting that Korach was not Jewish, right? He's not put outside the camp, he's just put underneath it. Right?
So there's a difference between a sinner and a non-Jew.
Yes. Okay, so Rashi is certainly okay with our having opposing views, but they have to be based somewhere within the tradition. Okay, so now let me take you to our last source in this segment, which is a teaching from Rav Kook. Okay, and Rav Kook, interestingly, as you can see here, was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi in Palestine, died in 1935. He was extremely orthodox in his practice, but he was also, in certain respects, very pluralistic in that he had relationships with many people who were not at all orthodox, and considered them to be a part of God's plan, a part of the Jewish community that, should not be written off, as many ultra-Orthodox Jews did then and today. Okay? So Rav Kook continues to be a very controversial figure in the ultra-Orthodox world. So here is a little bit of what he has to say. And this teaching is really a commentary on a line in the Talmud, which is also found in our Siddur, which says that Talmidei Chachamim, Torah scholars, increase peace in the world. So that, that at least is, something that one could surely question. And we would ask, what does that really mean? So here is what Rav Kook says about that. He says, for the building is constructed from various parts. The truth of the light of the world will be built from various dimensions, from various approaches. For these and those are the words of the living God. It is precisely the multiplicity of opinions which derive from variegated souls and backgrounds that enriches wisdom and brings about its enlargement. In the end, all matters will be properly understood, and it will be recognized that it was impossible for the structure of peace to be built without those orientations which appeared to be in conflict. Right? So his answer is, scholars are builders because their differences enrich wisdom and bring about greater understanding. And that can be true even with people from a variety of different backgrounds and positions and opinions, even from outside the what Ronnie referred to as the Torah Jew community. Okay? Comments or questions on any of this?
Just a remarkable statement from him.
From Rav Kook, from someone who was indeed a very Orthodox Jew, but significantly pluralistic in some important ways. Okay, anyone else? Okay, we are now going to head into the next unit of this course. I mean, the unit we've been dealing with is kind of an introduction to the entire course. And the subject of this is Judaism particularist or universalist, right? So particularism, meaning, you know, how devoted are we to our own group, our own Jewish group? Universalism, how concerned are we for humanity as a whole? And just to, you know, get you thinking about the tension between these two positions, I want to ask you to consider a question, and not to state the answer out loud or in the chat, but just think about this question. How much of your tzedakah money goes specifically to Jewish causes? And what do you think is the right balance? Is the balance that you've used, whether you've sort of worked that out and you plan out your tzedakah in that way, or it's just the way your household has evolved with the tzedakah that you give? Is that the percentage that you would want to keep? Hmm?
I mean this to be a serious question, not a joke about dues.
Please.
Are our synagogue dues part of tzedakah to a Jewish cause?
I would say so. Some might disagree with that.
Well, that's good for me. Going to change the percentages in each of those buckets significantly.
Lou.
Yeah.
The United States government looks at your synagogue dues as a charitable gift.
That's fine.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Anyone else have a thought? Yeah, Lou.
I think there needs to be a balance, even if it's a balance that is determined in one's own mind. That when, and I know that there are Jews who give very little specifically to the Jewish community because they consider themselves universalists. And I just don't think that's right. So, you know, when a Jewish charity comes calling, you need to give. You shouldn't say, well, I'm giving to the United Way, or I'm giving to the library, or anything else that's not particularly Jewish. There needs to be some Jewish component to tzedakah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you're not arguing that any Jewish tzedakah is deserving of your support.
No, of course not.
There's a limit, right?
There has to be.
Yeah.
You have limits on what you can give too.
Yeah. Ronnie,
This is very difficult because I am a universalist, and I believe tzedakah, charity, you start in the community where you live, and then you move outwards. And I do not base what I give on a person's religion. I base it on need. So I give to both Jewish causes and non-Jewish causes, but I start here in Houston.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of people have questioned me on it, why my first priority is not Israel. I do give, we buy bonds, I mean, I do give to Israel, but the bulk of the money that I choose to give is in my community because there is a need right here in Houston.
Yeah, yeah.
charity begins at home.
Anne?
Charity begins at home, and if home is Houston,
Okay, so that now that's interesting. Without saying that you are incorrect, Dan, because I wouldn't say that, is the teaching charity begins at home a Jewish teaching? Okay.
Well, even if it's not.
No. I wouldn't say that.
But then it's all on how you define home. You could say Judaism is home.
Yes. Or you could point to sources in the Jewish tradition that suggest that you put your community over the needs of other communities. And those teachings exist. Right? Maybe we'll get into that a little bit later. Somebody else had a comment or a question? Yeah, Liz.
Even though, yes, we, a lot of us give to the Jewish community, that's the first thought, but some of the organizations that people also give to, and I'm going to say the Cancer Society and other things, they also affect us as Jews and the greater community. So by giving to them, we are still helping our own community, but it's not maybe as direct or sometimes as personal. It may have some personal effect. I had family that's died of cancer, so I give to the American Cancer Society because, yes, they were Jews and, it is affected. But it's not per se a Jewish organization.
Mm-hmm. So all of your comments, I think, address different ways of how we deal with this tension, the tension between universalism and particularism, right? And certainly there's a tremendous amount of material in our own tradition about how we work with that, right? They are both essential Jewish ideas, and they live together, right? So Karen, you ask a question, how do you define your community? So let me toss that back to you. How do you define your community?
Well, I think about it as my religious community and my local community. So it's both to me.
Yes, because you live in overlapping communities.
Right.
Or even if they were separate communities, you still live in both.
Right.
Yes, Anne.
I would like to think that everybody in the world, regardless of their religion, and say they were Hindus. Okay, now we know that there are lots of gods in Hinduism, but if you look at it carefully, it all comes down to Brahman, Atman, which is one. So I want to give everybody in the world credit for believing in only one God and fulfilling all the other, if they're decent, laws of Noah, so that everybody in the world who isn't a mass murderer has a place in the world to come.
That's a pretty broad definition of community.
Well,
I'm not here to say that it's wrong. I'm just saying
excluded.
That's a very broad definition. Right? Other people are likely to have a more narrow view of what community means. But again, I think that Karen is right. There are overlapping communities, and that's part of how we deal with this question. Yes, Steve.
I want to add an overlapping term maybe to expanding. To my personal struggle in tzedakah is not necessarily with money. A little bit, it's mostly with service, because most of the boards that I'm on are Jewish or Israel related, and I keep struggling sometimes reaching out and getting involved, on some other boards, other community boards, or other boards that are not. And I've done that a little bit more lately. But that's personally my struggle more than tzedakah is easier, in some sense, as far as money goes.
Yeah. So one of the things that I hope you will get from this unit is the idea that an emphasis on community is a positive thing for the broader world, the universalist approach, and vice versa, that having an emphasis on universalism supports Jewish community priorities as well. And to frame this a little bit further, we have another video from Rabbi Jan Ullman, who you saw one from before. And Jennifer, if you're ready, pull up this video for us.
Can't hear.
Yeah, hold on, that didn't seem to work.
Jennifer's
Hold on
going to
one
fix
second.
that, I'm confident.
Hold on. Let me figure out what happened.
Do, 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 do,
Exactly.
do, 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 do,
Ah, here we go.
do.
Rabbi, you're dating yourself.
I don't remember. Where is that from?
That's a terrible pun, Daniel.
But with this
All right.
group,
I didn't even realize it, but yeah.
Jeopardy.
Okay. I got it.
Okay.
One second, let me go back to there.
Jewish thought and life is premised on a series of polarities and dialectic tensions, values, principles, truths, which are inherently contradictory or in conflict with each other, but which must necessarily coexist. In the words of the great physicist Niels Bohr, the opposite of a fact is a falsehood, but the opposite of one profound truth may very well be another profound truth. The texts we'll be studying today present one such dilemma or polarity. On the one hand, particularism. Our identities as Jews, our maintaining of distinct practices and beliefs, our sense of special obligations to one another, familial pride in each other's contributions to the world, and embarrassment at each other's moral failings. We're talking about the covenant of shared destiny, Jewish peoplehood. On the other hand, we have universalism, our common identity as human beings, our commitment to the fundamental equality and dignity of all people, our responsibilities toward and care and concern for all humanity. Not surprisingly, both particularism and universalism are deeply held Jewish values. First, particularism. From the moment God calls to Abraham in Genesis 12 to go forth and make a great nation, to the selection of first Isaac over Ishmael, then Jacob over Esau for the unique covenantal path, to the entire Exodus narrative, which we rehearse and reaffirm each Pesach, it's precisely about the creation of a particular people through shared history and narrative, leading to the moment of Sinai in which we make a covenant of values and behavior. And, of course, we have all the references to chosenness. From Exodus 19, "Now then, if you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. Segula mikol ha'amim. Indeed, all the earth is mine, but you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh." Or Deuteronomy 7, "For you are a people consecrated to Adonai your God. Of all the peoples on earth, Adonai your God chose you to be God's treasured people." And universalism? The very beginning of the Genesis narrative teaches us that we and every other person descend from the same common ancestors, and that each and every one of us is made in the image of God, possessed of creaturely dignity. Yes, God makes a particular covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the Torah is clear that God also makes a covenant with Ishmael, is concerned and involved with all peoples, and God demands that we too be concerned and involved as well. In fact, for the prophet Isaiah, the whole reason we're called to be a particularistic people is because we have a universalist mission. I, Adonai, in my grace have summoned you, and I have grasped you by the hand, God says through Isaiah. I created you and appointed you a covenantal people to be a light among nations, or goyim. For God has said, it is too little that you should be my servant, in that I raise up the tribes of Jacob and restore the survivors of Israel. I will also make you to be a light to nations, that my salvation may reach the ends of the earth. So, as Jews, are we supposed to be particularists, identifying as Jews, taking care of Jews? Or are we supposed to be universalists, identifying as human beings, caring for all people? The answer, of course, is yes and yes. Not only because the Torah says so, but because universalism and particularism are necessary expressions of our nature. We all need to view ourselves and our world through both lenses. But like all polarities or dialectic tensions, the reality is that sometimes we have a hard time holding both, or holding them in the right balance. Sometimes the values are really in conflict and we can't fulfill both. For example, time and money, even attention and compassion, are finite resources. Some of the texts in this unit address how to allocate them between specifically Jewish causes or broader concerns. How do you make those decisions? What factors drive you? Which news stories do you skim, and which do you really pay attention to, care about, do something about? Other times, circumstances may trigger one side or the other, or demand that we focus more intently on one side of the polarity. For example, when a nation is under attack, it would not be surprising to see a rise in particularism. But if we're concerned about the environment, we may need a more universalist approach. Our particularist or universalist instincts can be activated by the general culture around us, our own constellation of family and friends, generational differences, how safe or unsafe we feel generally, and how safe or unsafe we feel as Jews. And just as some of us may be nearsighted and have trouble seeing distance, and others have good distance vision, but have trouble seeing up close, we all have natural inclinations, which make us tend toward particularism or universalism. Whether or not we've ever thought about the terms particularism and universalism, they play a significant role in shaping our identities, and consequently tend to evoke very strong feelings. Indeed, this dialectic is at the root of some of the most difficult divisions within the Jewish community. For some of us, the idea of Jews as a chosen people is a source of pride and a great motivator to uphold the high standards that God demands of us. Others of us are embarrassed by such language as denigrating of other groups, and can't relate to a God who could choose one people over another. Whether we identify more strongly as particularists or universalists will shape what we think, and perhaps more saliently, how we feel about contentious issues like how we should respond to rising rates of intermarriage, or how we should talk about Israel, and what policies we should be advocating for. By embracing the notion of particularism and universalism as a dialectic, a dilemma to be managed, not a problem that can be solved, we may be able to better understand and appreciate the values and moral stance of those with whom we passionately disagree on these and other issues. To understand the focus on Jewish continuity, upholding the tradition, the safety and security of Jews first, not as racism or lack of concern for others, but as an expression of the deeply held Jewish value of particularism. And to understand the focus on the ethical treatment of the other, on concern for the equality and dignity of all people, not as betrayal of the Jewish people, but as an expression of the deeply held Jewish value of universalism. Let the debate continue.
We are just about out of time. So rather than take your comments and reactions, I'm going to ask you to make a note or two about what you just saw, any thoughts you had, reactions, questions, and we'll begin with that next Sunday morning. Okay? Thank you all very much. Those of you who are joining my next class, we'll begin in about 5. Thank you all. Jennifer, thank you.
All right, bye.
See you
Thank
later.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.